understanding among people. They can open the door to dialogue and peace building in ways that exclusion and division do not. The IOC Executive Board today reaffirms the steadfast commitment of the entire Olympic movement to help Ukrainian athletes in every way possible, in order to see a strong team from the National Olympic Committee of Ukraine at the Olympic Games Paris 2024 and the Olympic Winter Games Milano Cortina 2026. In order to achieve this, the IOC has already tripled its Solidarity Fund for the NOC of Ukraine to $7.5 million. At least 3,000 Ukrainian athletes and other members of the Olympic community of Ukraine have already benefited from the IOC Solidarity Fund through the NOC of Ukraine over the past 12 months, and from direct assistance from other Olympic movement stakeholders, including the international federations and the national Olympic committees. These efforts have taken the form of financial and logistical support in order to ensure that Ukrainian athletes can continue to train and take part in competitions by providing travel support, training facilities, accommodation, equipment, and uniforms, amongst other items. The IOC Executive Board reiterates today its strong condemnation of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which is a blatant violation of the Olympic truce that was in effect at the time, and a blatant violation of the Olympic Charter. For this reason, the IOC has already sanctioned the Russian and Belarusian states and governments who are solely responsible for this war in an unprecedented way. In particular, the IOC has recommended that no international sports events be organized in Russia and Belarus. No flag, anthems, or other national symbols whatsoever should be displayed at any international sports events, and no government or state officials should be accredited for or invited to any international sports events. These sanctions were put in place in February 2022 and were then reinforced and confirmed by the Olympic Summit on 9th of December 2022. The IOC Executive Board today underlines that these sanctions remain firmly in place. In the most recent series of consultations, the Olympic movement stakeholders reiterated their firm rejection of any political interference in the autonomous authority of sports organizations to decide on participation in their competitions. This clear and strong reaction to political interference was considered necessary because if governments took over the decisions regarding which athletes can take part in which competitions, it would be the end of world sport as we know it today. Sports organizations must have the sole responsibility to decide which athletes can take part in international competitions based on their sporting merits and not on political grounds or because of their passports. In all the deliberations, particular attention was paid to the views from the Ukrainian sports community. The 70 other ongoing armed conflicts and wars around the world were also considered, including the situations in the Middle East, the Horn of Africa, and the Southern Caucasus. It was noted that NOCs in the regions impacted by these armed conflicts and wars are following the principles of the Olympic Charter. They are not requesting the inclusion of athletes from the other party in the armed conflict or war, and they are allowing their athletes to compete in international sporting competitions without restrictions. The Olympic movement stakeholders also saw a need to address the protective measures for athletes and officials with a Russian or Belarusian passport that are currently in place, particularly in the context of the adoption of the sport as an enabler of sustainable development resolution by the United Nations General Assembly on 1st of December. This 2022, this resolution recognizes that, and here I quote, major international sports events should be organized in the spirit of peace, mutual understanding and international cooperation, friendship and tolerance, and without discrimination of any kind, and that the unifying and conciliative nature of such events should be respected. End of quote. It also explicitly acknowledges, and here I quote again, the Olympic Charter, and that any form of discrimination is incompatible with belonging to the Olympic movement. End of quote. This resolution was passed by consensus by all UN member states, including the governments of Ukraine, Russia, and Belarus. More recently, judgments by the Court of Justice of the European Union further confirmed that sanctions can solely be based on a person holding a passport or from a particular nation, nor can they be applied simply on the basis of affiliation. In addition, the urgent request expressed by the Special Rapporteur in the field of cultural rights and the Special Rapporteur on contemporary forms of racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance of the United Nations Human Rights Council was also taken into account. They said on 1st of February 2023, and please allow me to quote again, UN experts today commended the International Olympic Committee for considering allowing individual athletes from Russia and Belarus to take part in international sports competitions as neutral athletes. We urge the IOC to adopt a decision in that direction and to go further, ensuring the non-discrimination of any athlete on the basis of their nationality. End of quote. The Special Rapporteur in the field of cultural rights also joined the meeting of the IOC Advisory Committee on Human Rights on 16th and 17th of March 2023 and spoke with the athletes' representatives in their internal consultation call on 24th of March 2023. She also addressed the IOC members, national Olympic committees and international federations in their consultation calls. In her remarks, she considered also the legal arguments provided by the national Olympic committees of Ukraine and Germany. You will find the transcript of her remarks attached to the press release, which will be issued very soon. The IOC has to rely on the authority of the UN Special Rapporteur, who is appointed by the UN. And her mandate is, and I quote, to raise awareness, draw the attention of governments and others on alleged human rights violations, ask that the violations are prevented, stopped, investigated, or that remedial action is taken. End of quote. This is exactly what the Special Rapporteur has done. During the consultations with the Olympic movement stakeholders, which extended over a period of 4 months, the vast majority of the stakeholders were clear that they want a pathway to be opened for the competitions under their sole authority. They requested from the IOC recommendations in order to harmonize their approach in the event that they decide to admit athletes with a Russian or Belarusian passport to their competitions. The IOC strongly recommends that taking such a decision only with the provision that it can be revoked at the discretion of the international federation concerned. Following this request, the IOC Executive Board today issues to the international federations and international sports events organizers the following recommendations. 1. Athletes with a Russian or a Belarusian passport must compete only as individual neutral athletes. 2. Teams of athletes with a Russian or Belarusian passport cannot be considered. 3. Athletes who actively support the war cannot compete. Support personnel who actively support the war cannot be entered. 4. Athletes who are contracted to the Russian or Belarusian military or national security agencies cannot compete. Support personnel who are contracted to the Russian or Belarusian military or national security agencies cannot be entered. 5. Any such individual neutral athlete, like all the other participating athletes, must meet all anti-doping requirements applicable to them, and particularly those set out in the anti-doping rules of the international federations. 6. The sanctions against those responsible for the war, the Russian and Belarusian states and governments, must remain in place. No international sports events organized or supported by an international federation or a National Olympic Committee in Russia or Belarus. No flag, anthem, colors, or any other identifications whatsoever of these countries displayed at any sports event or meeting, including the entire venue. No Russian or Belarusian government or state official can be invited to or accredited for any international sports event or meeting. The IOC Executive Board also approved today detailed recommended conditions directed to the international federations, which you will find attached to the press release which you will receive very soon. Finally, the IOC Executive Board confirmed that these recommendations do not concern the participation of athletes and their support personnel with a Russian or Belarusian passport at the Olympic Games Paris 2024 or the Olympic Winter Games Milano Cortina 2026. The IOC will take this decision at the appropriate time, at its full discretion, and without being bound by the results of previous Olympic qualification competitions. Throughout the application of the above-mentioned exemptions by the international federations, the IOC will closely monitor the full implementation of these recommendations by all parties concerned. The results of this monitoring procedure will be an important factor in the decision by the International Olympic Committee concerning the participation of athletes with a Russian or Belarusian passport in the Olympic Games Paris 2024 and the Olympic Winter Games Milano Cortina 2026. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, President. As I said at the beginning, we have also with us James McLeod, NOC Relations, Kit McConnell, Sports Director, and Kavi Mahabi, Director of the Athletes Department, to help us through some of the details. And you will receive that statement momentarily, and attached to it, as the President said, will be details on the conditions of participation as well. So it should give you the full details you need. So let's now go to questions and answers, and I'll start with Rob Harris from Sky News. Rob, please go ahead and ask the President your question.
Hi, good afternoon. Based on what you're saying, are you potentially going to ban Russians and Belarusians from the Paris Olympics? Does not taking a decision today mean you're open to listening to the Ukrainian concerns and maybe still banning completely all Russian and Belarusian athletes from the Olympics?
I think the position is very clear, and I have just mentioned this, that we will monitor the implementation of these recommendations and then take a decision with regard to the participation in the Olympic Games at the appropriate time.
Thank you very much, Rob. Let's go to Carlos Groman from Reuters. Carlos, your question, please, to the President.
Thank you very much. Can you see me?
Yes, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you very much. Good afternoon, Mr. President. Good afternoon, Mark. A question on I will insist on the Russian Olympic Committee. You've mentioned the government, you've mentioned the athletes, you have not mentioned the ROC. And given that the president of the ROC has called it an honorable duty and an honorable duty of every citizen to fight in this war, will there be any sanctions for President Pozniakov? Thank you very much.
Let's go to James McLeod from NOC Relations to answer that question. James.
Thank you very much, Carlos, and good afternoon, good evening, and good morning to everyone online. With respect to the Russian Olympic Committee, as the President has just said, these decisions and recommendations are relating to international sports competitions that are taking place at the moment and not to do with the Paris or Milan Games, which are under the competency of the Russian Olympic Committee.
Thank you, James. Let's go to Mark von Tuyak from L'Equipe. Mark, please, your question.
Oui, bonjour Président, bonjour Marc, bonjour tout le monde. Est-ce que les décisions, les recommandations que vous avez annoncées tout à l'heure ont été prises à l'unanimité des membres présents du comité, de la commission exécutive?
Oui.
Pour la première fois, le président a répondu en français. Bon, merci. Let's go to Japan and Wakako Yuki from Yomiuri Shimbun. Wakako. I think you're there, Wakako. Please go ahead. Yeah.
I hope you can hear me. I hope you can hear me. Good evening, President.
Yes, we can. Please go ahead, Wakako.
Thank you for the opportunity. Could you give us some hint when you say appropriate time that IOC will decide for possible participation, may not be Paris or Milano Cortina, around when you would consider this appropriate? In a sense, of course, there are a timeline for the Olympic Games preparation, and around when would you like to see the decision? Also, there is an Asian game coming in this fall, and OCA had been regulating that they would be willing to invite some Russian and Belarusian athletes on an individual basis, whereas there are some concerns amongst Asian officials and athletes that depending on a sport with a certain sports format, a competition format, it would be very difficult for them to include Russian and Belarusian athlete and still see their own ranking intact. Would you be so kind to comment on this? Thank you.
Thank you very much. With regard to the first question, I can not give you an answer. This is why we said that at an appropriate time. Because we want to monitor the implementation of these recommendations, let's say, as long as possible. So then, in order to be enabled to take an informed decision, and therefore the executive board today did not consider it appropriate that to give a timeline, because in this extremely complex situation, nobody knows what's happening tomorrow or in 1 week or in 9 months. So we have just to monitor and then find the appropriate time. Sorry, I can not answer you more concretely. With regard to the second question, this is up to the international federations and to the continental federations. I don't think that there is a one-size-fits-all solution for this. This can be very different in a combat sports compared to a time sport like swimming. And therefore, this is in the best hands of the respective federations who know their competition systems, the best, and in particular in Asia, because they have already in the past accommodated the participation also of athletes from Oceania in their competitions without facing then these kind of problems. So there we have to trust them to find the fair solution in the interest of all their athletes.
Thank you, President. Let's go to USA Today and Nancy. Let's go first to Martin Ziegler. Sorry, Martin, you were queued up already, so please go ahead. Martin Ziegler from The Times in London.
Thank you, Mr. Bart. I think Vladimir Putin was one of the first people who called you after your election, and you had a close working relationship with him with Sochi. Has that relationship been an issue and you've been trying to look at this dispassionately? And have you had any communication with Mr. Putin in the last 12 months?
Mr. Putin was also the first person of whom the IOC withdrew an Olympic order.
Have you had any communication with him over the last 12 months?
I think you can draw your conclusions from that answer, Martin.
The answer to the second question is a clear no.
Thank you. Okay, let's move now. Yes, Nancy Amor from USA Today. Nancy, your question, please, to the President. Thank you, Martin. You're on mute, I think. I think you're on mute.
Sorry about that.
Yeah,
yes,
we can hear you.
sorry
Please
about
go
that.
ahead.
This is somewhat of a two-part question. Given that so many of the qualifications are already taking place or are about to take place, will the IOC consider reserving places or coming up with other qualification measures should you decide down the road to allow Russian and Belarusian athletes to compete? And as related to that, isn't this somewhat just kicking the can down the road? Because if you don't make a decision for several months, will there be ways for athletes from Russia and Belarus to qualify?
First of all, the qualification criteria are the responsibility of the respective international federations. And in this statement today, we have made it very clear that the IOC, when we will take the decision about the Olympic Games, will not be bound by the results of previous Olympic qualification competitions.
Thank you very much. Let's now go to Graham Dunbar from Associated Press. Graham, your question, please.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you.
You just put yourself on mute. But
yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Now I think we're good. Thank you, Mark. Mr. Bach, no one questions that this is an incredibly difficult diplomatic role that the IOC has in this. But you know, when you state what the Olympic values are and the unifying mission, it has seemed that this is warmly appreciated by Vladimir Putin and fundamentally disagreed with by Volodymyr Zelensky. Is this a position you are comfortable with, the positioning of the IOC in this debate, when you see who's on your side and who's against you?
We have been accused by the Russian side of being agents of US, and we have been accused by the Ukrainian side of being promoters of war. So we appear to be there somewhere in the middle. But you know, what is our main focus, and what has determined all the consultations we still had yesterday, the series of consultations, and also in particular today, the deliberations in the IOC Executive Board, that we are standing firm. We are standing firm by our values, which are enshrined in the Olympic Charter. We have to follow our mission. We have to follow the Olympic Charter. And the Olympic Charter speaks about this unifying mission, speaks about the political neutrality, speaks about the autonomy and the responsible autonomy of sport. And this is exactly what all these governments have also confirmed, in even 2 UN resolutions. We had the one on 1st of December last year, passed by consensus, and I've been given some quotes about this mission of sport and the IOC in particular, supported by the world community by consensus. And we have seen another resolution, being UN resolution, being passed on 23rd of February of this year, on the occasion of, I still do not have another word, I'm sorry, the anniversary of the Russian invasion in Ukraine, and which was tabled by Ukraine, which was drafted by Ukraine, and which is saying that the United Nations call on all the member states and international organizations to redouble their efforts to support the diplomacy in order to come to a peaceful solution of this conflict. So we are firmly standing by our values, and we have there the support of the world community for these efforts, and even the call to redouble our efforts.
Thank you, Graham. Let's go. I can see Rachel Backman already there. So, Rachel, please do go ahead and ask your question. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Hi, Thomas. For the Paris Games 2024, who exactly will adjudicate or decide whether Russian and Belarusian athletes meet the criterion of not being pro-war? Will it be the IOC or the sport federations or someone else?
No, these decisions have now to be taken, first of all, by the international federations. If they decide, or for the ones who decide to allow these athletes to participate, and for the rules and mechanisms, I can maybe refer to our sports director, Kit McConnell, because this has been addressed in more detail in the recommended conditions. So with your permission, I would like to hand over to him to elaborate a little bit on this.
Thank you very much, President. Thank you, Rachel, for the question. And firstly, I think as the first part of the response, Rachel, I just again highlight what the President has said, that your question was related to Paris 2024. And clearly there is no decision regarding Paris 2024 Olympic Games yet. This is regarding a return to international sport competition, and Olympic qualification is put to one side because we're not discussing Paris 2024 right now. In terms of that decision-making for the return to international sport, Rachel, the request from the federations was very clear to have a set of recommendations that would provide a harmonized approach across the different sports. And because there, again, we're discussing international sport rather than Olympic competition, you'll see when you have the chance to have a look at the recommended conditions of participation, that to allow that harmonized interpretation, that we're suggesting that the IF should consider creating a single independent panel under the umbrella of the respective IF associations, ASWAF for the Summer Olympic Federations, AWAF, the Association of the Winter Federations, and ARIS, which covers the recognised federations, to take those decisions, but those decisions reflecting the recommended conditions of participation that the President has outlined with those key points. And we believe that would allow the federations to take that harmonised approach that they have been requesting. Thank you.
Thank you, Kit. Let's go to Financial Times. Sarah Germano from London, I think. Sarah, ask your question, please. No, you're on mute. You're on mute, Sarah. Sorry. Can you? No, we cannot hear you. We'll come back to you in a sec. Let me just go to Alex Capstick from the BBC, Sarah, and we'll come back to you in a moment. Alex Capstick from the BBC, please, your question.
Thanks, Mark. Hello, Mr. President. World Athletics took a very different approach last week with their decision to ban athletes from Russia and Belarus. Could you just explain what you made of that and the words from Lord Kerr when he was very firm in saying they shouldn't be allowed to compete?
Thank you very much. As we have our sports director here, Kit McConnell, I think that's probably Kit, if you would like to take that one.
Yeah, thank you, Mark, and thank you, Alex. I think if we take a step back and look where the request came from, the Olympic Summit was the body that asked for the potential pathways back to be explored with all of the international federations. The Olympic Summit, we should note, is the body where all of the stakeholders of the Olympic movement, including the representatives of the international federations, are included. And that Olympic Summit in December requested the IOC to explore the pathway for athletes with a Russian and Belarusian passport to return to the international competition as individual neutral athletes. So the guidelines issued today for the international federations and the sport event organisers provide that framework for the implementation at their respective international competitions, where of course the IAFs, like World Athletics, have the sole authority. So they are the sole authority for their respective sports and govern their sport and their international federations and their competitions.
Thank you very much, Kit. Let's try and see if the FT's IT is any better. Sarah, can you, it may be ours, of course, but if you could try and ask your question again, Sarah Germano from the FT, if you're there. Okay, let's go now to Kostianci Varvalnik from Tribuna.com, please. Your question. I think you're calling from Ukraine.
Yes. Hello. Do you hear me?
Yes. Please go ahead with your question.
Yeah, so a year ago, the Executive Committee of the International Olympic Committee issued a recommendation to ban Russian Belarusian athletes. Today, you recommended the opposite. What has changed personally for you, Mr. President, and for the committee during this year as Russia continues the aggression against Ukraine? Thank you.
Okay. First of all, we are not recommending the participation. We are issuing very strict conditions for international federations who may want there to allow athletes with Russian or Belarusian passport to compete in their competitions which are under their sole authority. Secondly, the recommendation on 28th of February 2022 was not a ban, was not a sanction, it was a protective measure, which we had to take at the time for two reasons mainly. We had, first of all, a number of countries who wanted to decide and who decided which athletes can take part in which competitions by denying a visa for Russian or Belarusian athletes, by threatening their athletes with the withdrawal, or national federations or even national Olympic committees to withdraw funding if they would compete against Russian and Belarusian athletes. And the second reason was that we could not guarantee, and the hosts of any sports events could not guarantee for the safety and security of Russian or Belarusian athletes because of the very heated up atmosphere in a number of countries. This jeopardized the integrity of international sports competitions, and there, against our mission, and this is why we said from the very beginning we are in a dilemma. Against our mission, we had to issue this recommendation not to invite athletes from these two countries to international competitions to safeguard the integrity of international sports events and competitions. What has changed since then? There I could give a number of factors, but let me just maybe highlight two. One, we see that in a number of sports, tennis, cycling, handball, football, ice hockey, it's already working. You see athletes with a Russian or Belarusian passport participating in competitions. In some of these sports, even competing against Ukrainian athletes. And we have seen this, and we are seeing this almost every day. in particular in women's tennis and men's tennis in WTA and ATP, where then in a most recent final, even a Ukrainian player was winning in Austin, Texas, such a WTA a tournament against a player with a Belarusian passport. And we have many other examples. So we see that these athletes are getting visa to these countries. In this moment, it was US, but you have many others. These sports are all international sports. And that in some countries where it's needed, that these athletes or players are even getting working permits by the government, and that no serious problems with regard to their safety have been reported. So the reasons for these protective measures have changed a lot. And there the question which has been discussed in many of these consultations is why should what is possible in all these sports not be possible in swimming, table tennis, wrestling, or any other sport? What is the difference? Secondly, there is the clear statement by two independent UN special rapporteurs on human rights. And there, just allow me to clarify this, to quote some of these remarks. And the quote goes like this. Although we agree that this is an illegal war, the specific obligations of states continue to exist, and prohibition of direct discrimination is one of the most important values of the human rights system. We have to make sure that we do focus on states. I think it is absolutely perfect that the IOC and other areas as well have excluded the Russian Federation and Belarus. We have to start from agreeing that these states are going to be excluded. The issue is what happens with individuals. This is not a gray area of international law. It is something that binds all states and all individuals. It is actually so important that we call it peremptory norm of international law. For this reason, the blanket prohibition of Russian and Belarusian athletes and artists cannot continue. It is a flagrant violation of human rights. The idea is not that we are going to recognize human rights to people who are like us and with whom we agree on their actions and on their behavior. The idea is that anyone has the right not to be discriminated on the basis of their passport. End of quote. And the IOC, with the Olympic Charter, we are not only bound by our mission and by the rules of the Olympic Charter for non-discrimination. There, the Olympic movement is also recognizing the UN general principles with regard to human rights standards. And therefore, this very clear statement of independent UN rapporteurs who are commissioned and appointed